My name is Cal. I used to have a long name, but the winds blew it out to sea. Now they just call me Cal, or so say those who can say it. My room at the top of the lighthouse breathes with the sound of the waves. Every morning I watch the sun through the salt-crusted windows. But today the sun is a little more timid as it rises over the water. This morning is different. The salt smells heavier. The seaweed seems to cling more tightly to the stones. The copper spoon on my little table must have trembled in the morning. I can feel it. The end of the month is approaching. Marty, that grumpy old man, stands guard at the window. His tail doesn't move, his ears perked up. If Marty is quiet, you know something is coming. Something dark. I reached for the small box beside my bed. Inside were a few sailors' prayer scrolls, mint leaves, and a sprig of moon-dried seaweed. These were the weak weapons of the old world. But sometimes prayer is sharper than a rusty knife. My left knee groaned as I stood up, a memory of a stormy night. That night I saw the dead waves for the first time. As they say, sometimes the sea brings things back, and sometimes it sends what it doesn't want to the land in whispers. Here, on the last night of every month, the waves that come to my shore do not give peace even to the dead, as if something under the sea wants to touch the land. I felt the coolness of the bars as I descended the stairs. The lantern was breathing like a living thing. I checked the salt lines on the walls. None of them were intact. That meant we were safe, at least until this morning. When I went downstairs, Marty crept quietly behind me. There were salt crystals in his dark gray fur, as if he was aware of what was coming. In the corner of my small library sat a parrot. Its feathers were withered, its voice forked, but its gaze was still alive. "They're coming back, Cal," he said in a low voice. When Elgar, my parrot, speaks, it is not like an ordinary parrot, but as if a spirit from the past is whispering. My eyes drifted to the sea horizon. In the distance, a black outline could be made out among the blue-gray lines. There was still time, but not much. One more day of preparation. Maybe my last day. Maybe I will survive again. But one thing I knew. It's my duty to protect this beach. The light of the lighthouse cannot go out. And before the dead waves came again, the salt lines had to be renewed. The light of the lighthouse did not shine that morning. The sun had risen, but the windows were hazy, as if the sea had cast its shadow over the heart of the lighthouse. Elgar was silent. Marty disappeared into the shadows. I pulled an old tin box out of the cellar. Inside were amulets from years ago, knots covered in moss, some scraps of paper left over from priests' prayers, all written in seawater-resistant ink. Some of them were faded, the same preparation every month. But this time it was different. I didn't need to look for a reason to feel it. The sea was conscious, not restless as in previous months. There was something waiting underneath, and this something was impatient. I counted my steps as I walked up the stairs. 17, 18, 19. I paused. There were always 20 steps, but this time there was also the 21st. He wouldn't do that. Or not, I thought. I redrew the salt lines and put a sprig of mint leaves on the doorstep. Mint was the one thing that beings under the sea couldn't smell, for some reason. At that moment, I heard a click under the door, very faint, almost like a child's fingernail scraping the wood. I left my copper spoon on the doorstep, an old nautical rule. If you don't know what's behind the door, leave something copper. I stepped back and waited. Marty appeared out of nowhere and hissed at the door, his back hunched, his fur standing straight up. The copper spoon trembled. This was not a good sign. At that moment, Elgar flapped his wings and shouted in a high-pitched voice, "You're running late, Cal." "I know," I said in a whisper. I still didn't open the door. There was still time. It wasn't night yet. Something had moved outside the salt lines. I hadn't seen it with my eyes, but it was there. Maybe a shadow, maybe just an illusion. But the inside of the lantern was now safer than the outside. And that rarely happened. I went upstairs to the top of the lantern. There, behind the big lamp, a chest is hidden. Only I know it. I took silver bullets out of the chest. On them were symbols engraved with a snapdragon flower. Snapdragon, the only flower against those without a soul. I put the bullets around my waist. I said the prayers. And I sat and waited. The moon had not yet risen, but the sky was strangely silent. Even the seagulls were silent. And that's when I realized this night will be longer than the previous nights. The night descends to the sea first in blue. Then it turns purple. Finally, it spreads like a black blanket, covering every wave. When the moon rose, everything was already quiet. But this silence, it wasn't the kind we know. There was a humming, not at the edge of my ear, but at the edge of my heart. Marty curled up in the shade of the lamp, but his eyes were open. Elgar ruffled his feathers, banged his beak against the glass. "They're rotting again," he said softly. I looked down from the top of the lantern. The coast is not dark despite the night, because dead waves come with light. The sea began to foam, but there was no wind. This was the most terrible thing. The waves were like the breathing of something, and with each breath, a mark was left on the sand. The first steps, they don't stand, they crawl, as if they had no feet. As if their bones, which have grown long with time, don't want to disturb the earth. But I heard it. The familiar, sickly sound of bare flesh against wet sand. First came the smell of decay, then something mixed with moss, like the smell of salty clothes worn by the dead. My old self trembled inside me. That old Cal, that man who walked without a limp, who forgot to pray, who believed that everything could be solved with a gun. He's not here anymore, but his fear was still with me. I took my copper spoon. I left it on the edge of the glass. It glowed in the moonlight. And then, it went out. The light was swallowed. Elgar became silent. Marty stood up, and I rang the old bell under the lamp 3 times. Because it was a ritual. The lantern is not just light. It is a warning. And the sound of this bell reaches not only the creatures, but also the forgotten souls on the shore. Some still remember the prayer. Others only miss the darkness. At that moment, something moved outside. The shadow of the crawler touched the stones of the lantern, and one of the salt lines cracked. The first line, the first crack. That's when the war began. When the salt line cracked, the flashlight tingled. Yes, it did. The walls groaned slightly. The stones rubbed against each other, reminded of themselves like an old wound. Some structures are not just stone. The lantern is one of them. I knelt at the head of the line. My fingers moved reflexively. I took out the bag of salt from my bag, sprinkled a new layer on the crack with trembling hands. But this time, the salt was black. "They're passing," I said. "They're used to the smell." Marty hissed, shivering. Elgar flapped his wings, not screaming, but the panic in his eyes was enough. That's when we heard it. The sound of something wet crawling on the stones. No footsteps, no claws. It was more like the moaning whisper of flesh, of a body forced to crawl. I looked at the door. The salt line was still intact, but it would only last a few more minutes. I was left with silver bullets, mint leaves, and a single prayer. I picked up the short spear hanging from a nail in the wall, its handle wrapped in moss. Underneath was a saying written in the old language. "Break the bone of him who has no life. Forget the name of him who has no voice." The old knowledge inside me began to speak. The teachings of those old priests. To fight silence, first listened to silence. A sound came from downstairs in the lantern. Knock, knock, knock. Then harder. Tack, 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 tack. The presence behind the door was now intent on entering. I nailed the copper spoon to the door. I wrapped a snapdragon flower around it. I turned off the lamp on the wall, because some things only become visible in the light, and not seeing them sometimes means staying alive. The door groaned, the wood cracked, the salt line disintegrated, and in that moment, someone or something slipped in through the darkness. The first thing I saw were his eyes, but they weren't eyes. They were cloudy, cracked, like old lantern glass at the bottom of the sea, and there was no light coming out of them. Just emptiness. It was as tall as a man, but it had no arms. The moment it crawled in, it touched the mint leaves on the floor tiles, and he screamed. Thin, high-pitched, like the cry of a seagull mixed with a human voice. But only those with a soul could hear it. I heard it, and I didn't retreat. I thrust the spear forward. I pressed the tip into the center of the creature, not in the flesh, because it had no flesh, but it had a void, and silver penetrates the void. There was a cracking sound. The creature disintegrated as it came, like sea foam, as if it didn't exist. But the salt in the room no longer worked. We had fended off the first attack, but that was only the beginning, because now they had managed to get in. After the creature dispersed, the lantern did not stop. The walls were still breathing. It was as if it wasn't just that being that had managed to get in. Something had woken up. The spear in my hand dangled. The silver at the end had begun to bear black cuts. Marty was still staring at the door with his back arched. Elgar wasn't talking this time, but he was tapping the wood with his beak. 3 times. Knock, 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 knock. It's a warning. Come down. I didn't want to. The downstairs of the lighthouse had been closed for a long time, chained, prayed, sealed. But some doors are opened, not by time, but by fear. I started removing the stones from the floor one by one. I remembered what I had put under them, but seeing them was something else. 5 stones, 3 seals, a prayer, and then that old lid, a rusty ring, mossy edges. Marty growled. Elgar broke the silence. You're gonna have to take that off, Cal. I know, I said. I knelt. I took a breath, and I opened the hatch. The darkness wasn't going down. It was going up from there. It was as if there was darkness at the roots of the lantern, and we were just trying to live in the branches. The stairs were narrow, wet. My ankle ached with every step. My limp reminded me again. But mostly it was the past, because it was the first time I faced a creature. I groped in the darkness. My fingers recognized the ancient symbols on the wall, carved by the priests, not a cross. Older things, wolf heads, seashells, moon faces, forgotten protectors. It was at the bottom, a stone box. It had my name on it. Calbrecht Davarin. I didn't even use my last name anymore. I opened the box. Inside, a pair of gloves, sealed with salt and blood, sewn with silver thread. The last defense that the priests once prepared for the knights of the church. But when I took these gloves off, I burned a brother, trying to save him. I had failed. That's why I sealed it. I even hid it from myself. Now I had to put those gloves back on. When I put them on my hands, the leather still felt alive. I heard a sigh. I don't know whose it was, but the stones of the lantern heated up. A scream came from above. Marty meowed. Elgar shouted, "You're not alone anymore." I closed the door, but I knew I was no longer the only one walking the halls of the lighthouse. Something went upstairs with me. The moment I put the gloves on, something changed. It wasn't my hands I've changed. It's as if the skin stuck to my veins. Stitches sealed with salt, stabbed deep into the past. And that's when I realized these gloves weren't just made to protect. They were meant to remind me. The first night, first blood, the first scream. When I went upstairs, the lantern was colder, but its walls were breathing warmer. This was not good, because the lighthouse only behaved like this when it was in danger. As I climbed the stairs, my hand caught on the bell rope. I pulled on instinct. 1, 2, 3. It was as if someone inside me wanted me to pull that rope. Maybe it was the gloves. Maybe it was me, still living that night. After the bell rang, everything sped up, crackling in the attic. 3 fingerprints on the glass, and a shadow on the wall. But this shadow was not from outside. This shadow was me. I looked at my hands. Thin black smoke was coming out of the seams of the glove. It was as if I had accumulated guilt, regret, fear. It was taking a physical shape. "You're in control, Cal," Elgar said. But his voice no longer sounded like a bird, but like an old friend. I couldn't remember who it was, but it hurt. Marty put his body in front of me. I knew that little body could be as strong as a creature, because Marty wasn't just a cat. He was sealed like me. I approached the second line of salt on the ground, but this time I couldn't cross it. The salt pushed me. I whispered, "What nonsense is this?" And at that moment, a voice came from inside the lantern. "Who are you?" It's not an echo. It's a real question. As if the lantern didn't recognize me anymore. I reached out my hand. My gloved fingers touched the line, and the salt burned. It glowed with a white light. Then it went out and burned out. I said, "You don't recognize me anymore, do you?" I leaned against the stones of the lantern. My heart was as heavy as my spear. Because I get it. Tonight, not only against the creatures, I would have to fight against myself. And maybe that would be the hardest thing. The walls of the lantern were different tonight. Each step groaned underneath like a secret. It was as if I was walking inward, not upward. Marty was silent. Elgar was on my shoulder, murmuring a prayer I had never heard before. The words were like letters trembling on the edge of ancient languages, touching my soul, not my ear. The first thing I noticed when I crossed the stairs was that the second door was open. That door was locked. I knew this because I was the one who made the lock. The moonlight streamed in through the lantern window like a thin knife. Where the light hit, something was waiting. A tall, thin silhouette. Not quite human, not quite something else. Head bowed, no hands. But it had a voice. "Cal," he said. He just said my name, just like the one that called to me all those years ago, just before I drowned under the sea. My eyes widened. I raised my silver spear, and the inside of my gloves burned. This creature was different from the others. This creature was once my brother. "Are you Dorian?" I said, not even believing the question as it came out. But the being looked up. It had no eyes. In their place were dark sockets that flickered like thin rings of waves. But it looked at me with those eyes. "You couldn't save me, remember?" It was a hoarse, wheezing voice, but so familiar. My spear felt heavy in my hand. My left hand trembled. The stones of the past shifted inside me. Dorian. I had lost him years ago. I had failed to protect him. And tonight, the past I had failed to protect had become flesh and blood before me. Marty growled, but not at me, not at the creature, at the hesitation in me. "It's not him," Elgar said, "but it's using his voice." I squinted. Yes, I realized it now. His movements are wrong, his words slow. Not a real memory, but an imitation, a kind of echo. But this echo had a purpose. To stop me, I gripped the spear with both hands. I took the mint leaves between my teeth. "Dorian is not here," I said, "and you cannot speak his name." The being screamed. It was loud enough to crack seashells, but as unwarranted as a single gust of wind. It did not approach the salt. This surprised me. It didn't attack like the others. Instead, it retreated and merged with the ground, as if it had never existed. But it left a mark, a word carved into the wall just above the salt line. Remember, it wasn't a threat. It was a warning, or a sign. My fingers went numb inside my gloves. Silver hurts when it touches memory. And tonight, I was both remembering and fighting. "There will be more to come," a voice inside me said. But another voice, a deeper, older voice. "One of them knows you. And if you don't stop him, tonight, the lantern will fall." As the wind cut through the night, the lantern pushed me outside for the first time. I didn't open the door. It opened. Elgar flew over my shoulder without a word. Marty, uncharacteristically, did not follow. It was as if they both knew I had to be alone on this journey. Or there was something else telling me I had to be alone. As I descended the rock steps, my cane clattered against the stone, each echo turning into the footsteps of the dead on the walls of the lighthouse. By the time I reached the shore, the moon had risen and the sea was dark. The waves were slow and heavy. Dead waves. The monks called these nights nights of the depths. Because the sea didn't only carry water, it also brought memories. And sometimes, the body. When my feet touched the sea, a shiver ran through me. That first salty water that mixes with soil, stone, and the past always tells a little too much. My gloves began to darken. Silver either shines or burns when it comes into contact with the sea. Tonight, it was burning. That was a bad sign. There was something on the shore, half buried in the seaweed. A wooden box wrapped in rusty iron. Thin, dried seashells stuck to it. But what really caught my attention, the mark engraved on the box. One of the oldest seals of the lighthouse. Only the priests know it. And the priests have been gone for years. I opened the box. Inside was a twine, a wad of paper, and an amulet made of seashells. When I held the amulet, my knees trembled. This was the amulet I carried as a child. I thought I'd lost it, but here it is, by the sea. Someone or something had brought it back to me. I unfolded the paper. The ink was blurred, but the words were still alive. One sentence. "The lantern is not only light, it also has a shadow. Be careful of its shadow." I stood up slowly. The waves were receding, but something in the sea was still watching me. It couldn't be seen, but it could be felt. A look, an intention, an echo. Then a voice came from behind me. Not a whisper, but a child's voice. "Cal, before you go back, take me with you." I turned. There was nothing. But a pair of small footprints had appeared in the sand, like they were written in salt. My heart burned more than my gloves. The lantern wasn't calling me tonight. The lantern was warning me. Turning back was no longer just a walk. It was a choice. And sometimes, the choice was harder than the creatures. When I returned to the threshold of the lighthouse, the wind had stopped. It was neither cold nor hot. Everything seemed suspended. Even the silence did not breathe. The amulet in my hand was like a heavy stone in my palm. Yet it was a tiny thing. But the memory inside had opened a huge crack in me. When I stepped through the door, Elgar came back. He didn't land on my shoulder this time. He just flew to my bedside. "You can't walk alone anymore," he said. His voice sounded more like a human voice now. It was as if it was changing shape, or remembering shape. The inside of the lantern was dark. The walls had faded. The lamps had gone out. The salt lines were cracked, some were erased. Marty was waiting for me, but this time his eyes were fixed on something else. The narrow door at the top of the lantern. That door hadn't been opened for years, because it was the shadow room, the place where the lantern's memory was stored. Every guard knew of its existence, but none dared to enter. The door had sealed itself. Until tonight, the amulet in my hand recognized the lock of that door. When I brought it closer, the drop of salt inside the amulet liquefied. Then a sound came from the door, not the creaking of wood, but a sigh, like someone crying for the first time in years. The door opened. It wasn't dark inside. On the contrary, it was extremely bright. But this light was not warm, it was cold. A dazzling whiteness. It was as if all the lantern's past, all its sin had been collected in this room, and now it had decided to show itself. In the center of the room was a stone table. On it was an old helmet, a rusty chain, and 3 objects lined up side by side: a crucifix, a silver bullet, and my childhood picture. "How can this be?" I said aloud. Elgar spoke once more. "You're not the first, Cal, but you may be the last." Something inside me broke. The lantern had been watching me for years, not just to protect me, to change, to prepare. Because tonight, not only would the creatures return, the shadow itself would awaken. The chain on the stone table suddenly moved. It untied itself and began to form a shape on the floor. A thin, circular symbol, an eye in an infinity sign. I recognized it. It was the sign of the first keeper. Legend has it that the first keeper of the lantern had sealed the shadow before creating the light. But the seal had cracked over time. And now, I was in his place. Marty hissed slightly. His tail swelled. The sound of the walls changed. This time they weren't crying. They were praying. And as they prayed, the stone stairs inside the lantern began to turn by themselves. The door did not close, because there was no longer a door. The border was gone. Light and shadow were walking down the same staircase. The lantern was flickering. The stone walls seemed to crack within themselves. Something wanted out, or maybe something wanted back in. At the bottom of the stairs lay a silence heavier than all the battles I carried inside me. The amulet in my hand no longer glowed, nor did my silver spear shine. For this was no longer a battle between light and darkness. It was a battle of remembering. When I went downstairs, the walls were different. They weren't built of stone, but of salt. Each line of salt was a memory. And as I stepped on each one, I was crushed inside myself. There was a child crying. There Dorian was screaming. There was my mother hugging me for the last time. The lighthouse wasn't just a tower. The lighthouse was a mind. Mine. He was at the bottom, a faceless body shaped in the shadows. But I knew what he was. He was everything I had forgotten. "Cal," he said. His voice was hoarse, coming from more than one place. "We didn't protect you. We trained you, because you are the frontier." I didn't back away, because I wasn't afraid anymore. Marty stood to my left. Elgar put my amulet down, and for the first time, I opened my hands, not to resist, to accept. "Shadow," I said, "you are my fear, my loss, my weakness, but you will no longer control me." I took a step. The shadow did not retreat, but it changed shape. His face became like mine. It looked like Dorian, one of the priests, my mother's hands, everyone. Because the shadow of the lantern didn't just belong to me. It belonged to all the keepers, all the protectors, all the believers. The lantern was their hope, and its shadow, their sin. The amulet burned in my hand. It wasn't a talisman, it was a seal. And I was the last seal. "I forgot your name," I told the shadow, "but I won't remember it anymore." Then the amulet fell to the ground, and the silence was broken. Not a scream, but a breath. The salt lines reappeared, the ceilings, the stones, the light. Everything returned to its place, but with one difference. The light of the lantern was no longer warm, nor was it cold. It was balance. The shadows were still there, but no longer alone. There was an eye looking at them, and that eye was me. In the morning, Marty was asleep on my knee. Elgar was standing guard at the window, and I was still alive. But I'm not just a keeper anymore. I am the lighthouse itself. On the last night of every month, dead waves will hit the shore again, and I will rise up every time, because the darkness always comes. But if someone is watching, he's never alone.